Howdy folks, and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. Although I should start off this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles with giving you all fair warning. I am absolutely exhausted. It has been a very long weekend. I don't necessarily mean that this is going to be a shorter than average episode of Mingles with Jingles, but it might be. I'm just going to keep going as long as I can, and when I can't keep going, I'm going to stop. And that will be this week's episode of Mingles. There were a couple of things that I did want to talk about, though. And the first was Armoured Warfare. Obviously, there's been a lot of fuss over the course of the last couple of weeks on the internet about what's happened to Obsidian Entertainment. They were developing Armoured Warfare, which was being published by My.com, and My.com were owned by Mail.ru, which is a huge Russian games multimedia entertainment company. And there were some fairly substantial differences of opinion between the three about what direction Armoured Warfare should be going. Obsidian wanted to do something a bit different with Armoured Warfare, and Mail.ru, and since they were paying the checks, that also meant My.com, basically just wanted a World of Tanks clone, except with modern vehicle skins. They just wanted a slice of the mountains of money that Wargaming.net are raking in with World of Tanks, and Obsidian thought they could do better than that, but Mail.ru just didn't want to take any chances, and they weren't prepared to pay Obsidian to take any chances, and so Obsidian are sacked, effectively. They're no longer working on Armoured Warfare, and all development has moved to My.com in Russia. So, that's just summarised the situation. Now, the reaction to that. I'm not entirely surprised by the sense of outrage that most of you seem to express that Obsidian had basically been given their marching orders. And yet, at the same time, I can't help but feel that a large part of that reaction is driven by the fact that it's a Western games developer, and I probably need to be very careful what I say here, but a Western game developer has basically been sacked by a Russian paymaster. And I feel that, because let's be honest here, most of you don't play Armoured Warfare, and a fair number of you have never played Armoured Warfare. And yet there was kind of general all-round outrage and condemnation when the news appeared that Obsidian had been sacked by Mail.ru. Now, I accept that you don't have to be an Armoured Warfare player in order to feel a sense of outrage over what happened to Obsidian. But it seems pretty obvious that the majority of people expressing their outrage haven't played Armoured Warfare in months. I mean, they can't have, otherwise the server populations wouldn't be as low as they are. So I do strongly suspect that the majority, the initial reaction at least, was motivated more by how dare those Russians do that to a Western games developer, rather than motivated by people who actually had anything invested into Armoured Warfare. So, bearing that in mind, and I have to admit that was my initial reaction as well. Those dirty Russians, how dare they, and so on and so on and so on. And let's face it, the majority of the people watching my videos are Westerners. So, you know, if you ask them to choose between a Western games developer and a Russian publisher, they're going to side with a Western games developer. And there's always been that sympathy for the underdog in Western culture as well, with Obsidian obviously being the underdog. And then I had a fairly large minority of my viewers come from Eastern Europe, countries that were on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War and suffered under the Soviet Union, and have no love whatsoever for the Russians either. So I do suspect that a lot of the initial sense of outrage that was prevalent on the internet and in the comments of my previous two episodes of Mingles with Jingles at the news that Obsidian had received their marching orders from Mail.ru was motivated by, well, damn those Russians, how dare they, rather than, oh no, what's going to happen to Armoured Warfare? Because let's face it, most of you don't play Armoured Warfare, and if you did play Armoured Warfare, you haven't played it in ages. Now, what I'm actually trying to do here, I'm not interested in pointing fingers and saying, oh, how dare you have an opinion about Armoured Warfare? You weren't there, man, you never played it. You know, it's not that. What I'm trying to do is take a step back, take a deep breath, right, not react emotionally to the news, and just have a look at the facts and see what this actually means. Because it's not necessarily a case of having to make a choice between good or bad here, with Obsidian developing being the good and mail.ru and my.com developing being the bad. It's entirely possible for both scenarios to have a good outcome, just different kinds of good. And I'll explain what I mean. We already know that if Obsidian had been left to their own devices and mail.ru just quietly continued signing the checks, then you would have had a game that was substantially different to World of Tanks. Or at least as different as two arcade tank shooters can be. I mean, at the end of the day, you're both still driving around virtual vehicles and shooting at other virtual vehicles in a sort of semi-realistic manner while still being an arcade game. There are certain things that do set Armoured Warfare apart from World of Tanks that are unlikely to change, at least in my opinion, and, well, artillery being the prime contender here, works completely differently to the way artillery works in World of Tanks. So, in fact, if you go onto the Sandbox server, artillery in World of Tanks works completely differently to the way artillery works in World of Tanks, but yeah, that's an entirely different story. The artillery system in Armoured Warfare seems to be quite popular. Nobody really appears to have any major complaints with it, unlike the current artillery system in World of Tanks. And, well, if we're talking about making the game more like World of Tanks, I suspect that they're probably not going to touch the way artillery works. They're definitely not going to be making artillery work more like the way it does in World of Tanks, because that's one of the things that people hate about World of Tanks. And in fact, if there was one thing about Armoured Warfare that, more than anything else, was going to get people to abandon World of Tanks and play Armoured Warfare instead, it would be the way Armoured Warfare's artillery works. So they'd be absolutely stark raving mad to mess around with that and make it more like World of Tanks. It's one of the best things about Armoured Warfare. So when the phrase making the game more like World of Tanks gets thrown around, I genuinely don't think that's one of the things that you need to worry about. So what do they mean by making the game more like World of Tanks? Well, they've actually announced something. A set of very specific changes that are going to make Armoured Warfare play a lot more like World of Tanks. And this is not a recent announcement. This news has not come out since Obsidian were fired. This news is months old. I have actually talked about this in a previous video, and at the time the reaction to it, on the whole, seemed to be, yeah, actually that kind of makes sense, yeah. Seems like a good change. And the change that I'm talking about is the way vehicles scale between the tiers in Armoured Warfare. And this is all part of the whole Balance 2.0 process that's been happening in Armoured Warfare for quite some time. So this is not new news. In fact, the change that I'm about to discuss was actually announced on the 1st of December last year. So this news is almost 3 months old. And I think it's worth bringing it up again just as an example of how making Armoured Warfare more like World of Tanks isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it depends what they change to be more like World of Tanks. And the example that I'm going to give is, because this is the actual example that was given in the developer bulletin when this change was announced, is a tier 4 main battle tank fighting a tier 6 main battle tank, because that can and does happen. That's the matchmaking spread. Tier 4 vehicles can fight tier 6 vehicles, and yet in a one-on-one fight, under the current scaling system, which, let's not forget, was Obsidian's idea, under the current scaling system, it's next to impossible for a tier 4 main battle tank in a one-on-one fight to beat a tier 6 main battle tank, and it's next to impossible for a whole bunch of reasons. T-64, tier 4 main battle tank, and the T-72A, tier 6 main battle tank, they both effectively have the same gun. It's the same caliber, and yet one of them does 455 damage per shot and the other one does over 600. T-64 and T-72 are actually very good examples for a number of reasons. First, they were actually in service with the Soviet Union at the same time. And it's not just that they have the same caliber gun, they have the same gun. Right, so this just points out how ludicrous the current Armoured Warfare system is, where you've got two tanks with the same gun, but one of them has vastly superior damage per minute, vastly superior alpha damage, it's got more health, better penetration. With the T-72A, it's not inconceivable that you could knock out a T-64 from full health in 2 shots. You just get a good damage roll on those 2 hits, and the T-64 is toast. But the T-64, with the same gun as the T-72, is going to have to hit that T-72 4 or 5 times, in theory, under the best possible circumstances, assuming it penetrates with every shot that it fires. And in practice, it's probably not going to penetrate with every shot that it fires, so it's going to take maybe 6, maybe 7 shots to knock out the T-72A. It's just no contest. Now that is the current Armoured Warfare system. Now, as part of Balance 2.0 in Armoured Warfare, I've been talking about changing that. Remember, this announcement was made nearly 3 months ago. And instead of having things like damage scaling based on the tier of the vehicles, which is what they currently have, they're talking about switching the damage scaling and having it based on the caliber of the gun doing the shooting. So, as an extreme example, the Leopard 1 main battle tank, it's a tier 3 main battle tank, but it has a 105mm gun. Meanwhile, at tier 8, the M1182 MGS is a tier 8 tank destroyer, and it also has a 105mm gun. The Leopard 1 does 263 damage per shot, and the M1182 does 554. Well, under Balance 2.0, they're both going to do around about 420 damage per shot. Oh, hang on a minute. What's the point of grinding your way up to tier 8 if you're going to be doing the same damage per shot as a tier 3 main battle tank? Well, yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, let's not forget that a tier 8 vehicle is much more modern. So you're going to have a much, much better fire control system, so your accuracy and possibly also your rate of fire are going to be superior, and you're going to have much more modern ammunition, so your penetration is going to be way better. So your damage per minute, both theoretical and practical, is going to be superior. Because you're doing the same amount of damage, but you're hitting more often, you're penetrating more often. So you'll still have that advantage if you're in a higher tier vehicle, but it'll no longer be next to impossible for you to successfully win a one-on-one fight. For example, if you're in a tier 4 T64 in a PvP match and you're having to fight a tier 6 T72, because they're both going to be doing the same damage per shot, while the T72 will be more accurate and will have better penetration because it's going to have more modern ammunition. The actual damage per minute is not going to be substantially different, and the damage per shot is going to be exactly the same. Now, when this news was announced, all of 3 months ago, almost, it was greeted with general approval, because it does seem to make a lot of sense, and it's certainly going to make things more competitive if you find yourself at the bottom end of the feeding chain in a random battle, while still giving the higher tier vehicles some kind of advantage over the lower tier vehicles. And yet this is actually making Armoured Warfare more like World of Tanks. They just didn't present it as making Armoured Warfare more like World of Tanks. It was presented as making things more competitive for the guys that find themselves at the bottom end of the feeding chain, separated by 2 tiers from the guys at the top end of the feeding chain in a random battle. Because this is the system that they have in World of Tanks. I felt it was just, very important to point this out. Have a look at all those German 88mm guns, for example. They all do 240 average damage in World of Tanks, don't they? It doesn't matter whether you're in the Tier 7 Tiger with the long 88, it's 240 average damage, or you're in the Tier 9 E75 with the long 88. It's doing 240 average damage. How about all those Soviet heavy tanks in World of Tanks? The Tier 6 KV-85 can fit the D-25T 122mm gun with 390 average damage. The IS-4 is a Tier 10 heavy tank. It can fit the D-25T 122mm gun, which also has 390 average damage. See, in World of Tanks, the damage of your gun is tied to the caliber of the barrel. It's got next to nothing to do with the tier of the vehicle. This is how World of Tanks does it, and they're already talking, and have been talking, about making Armoured Warfare more like World of Tanks in the interests of game balance. It just wasn't presented as we're doing this to make the game more like World of Tanks. And nobody had any objections when it was presented like that. So, this is the point that I'm trying to make here. Armoured Warfare becoming more like World of Tanks isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I'm sure in many ways it could be. But the ways that they're planning on making the game more like World of Tanks, as discussed in various different developer bulletins, and as currently being tested on the Balance 2.0 test server, they're not necessarily bad things. And this is exactly what I'm talking about here. Because everybody's initial reaction was, oh no, the Western developer has been fired, and the Russians are taking over, and it's just going to be a World of Tanks clone. Oh, this is bad, this is bad. Well, the potential is certainly there for it to all go horribly wrong, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to be bad just because Obsidian have been given their marching orders. I am sorry that we're now never going to see the game that Obsidian wanted to make, because I'm positive it would have been interesting and certainly worth playing. But just because we're not going to see that game does not necessarily mean that the game that we're going to get is not going to be worth playing either. That's the point I'm trying to make here. You just have to take a deep breath, calm down, step back, take a fresh look at the situation, try not to have an emotional reaction, and just look at the facts. And the facts are that Armoured Warfare, nearly 3 months ago, announced a bunch of changes, long before the news broke that Obsidian and Mail.ru were going their separate ways. And these changes, whether we realised it at the time or not, were already going to make the game more like World of Tanks, and nobody had a problem with it at the time. Because the way those changes were presented wasn't, hey, we're making the game more like World of Tanks. They were presented in a logical way that, when you stop to think about it, actually made a whole bunch of sense and can only make the game better. I have to admit, my initial reaction on hearing the news that Obsidian had been sacked was, and I'm sure most of you had pretty much the same reaction as well, was, oh, fantastic. Well, that's it, I'm done. Obsidian are out. I've just lost all interest in Armoured Warfare. But then I calmed down, took a step back, took a fresh look at the actual facts of the situation as far as the game development process is concerned, and thought, well, the changes that they're talking about, they don't seem like bad changes. I'm basically adopting a wait-and-see policy as far as Armoured Warfare is concerned. I'm not spending any more money on the game until I can see which way the wind is blowing, but based on early indications, the changes that they are talking about, well, they seem like the kind of changes that the game does actually need. I haven't uninstalled the game just yet, and I do in fact still log in and play a couple of times a week, but I'm basically just marking time until I can see exactly what making the game more like World of Tanks actually involves, because it's not necessarily a bad thing. Anyway, that's quite enough of that. Hopefully it's given you something to think about, and I'm sure you'll have your own opinion in the comments section. That's what it's there for after all. Anyway, moving along swiftly. I did something new this week with this week's Casual Saturday video. This week's Casual Saturday was my first ever sponsored video. What's a sponsored video, Jingles? Good question, glad you asked. The short answer to that question is, I got paid for the first time ever to do a review of a video game. Some people didn't like that. Which is understandable. I mean, it was to be expected. I was very, very surprised at how few people didn't like that, however. I was expecting there to be a hell of a lot more backlash. The slightly longer version of what is a sponsored video, well, it kind of works like this. I belong to a YouTube partner network called BBTV, Broadband Television, and I have a manager at Broadband Television, a very, very nice person called Melissa. And Melissa gets handed all kinds of offers, exactly like this, from various different games developers. And she is entirely aware of the kind of games that I cover, and occasionally she approaches me with some of these offers because she thinks that I might actually like to take a look at some of these games. This is not the first time I've been offered money to do a review of a game, but it is the first time I've been happy to do it. And the reasons for that, well, they're fairly simple actually. It kind of all boils down to the one question: how much is my reputation worth? Because what happens the second you accept money from a games developer to do a review of their game, your impartiality gets called into question. Now, some people made the comment that when you're reading a review of a game on the PC Gamer website, you don't question the impartiality of the games reviewer. He's being paid to review the game. Well, yeah, but there's a difference. That game's reviewer is being paid by the website that he works for. He's not being paid directly by the game's publisher or developer. He's getting paid regardless of whether he posts a good or a bad review. So in that respect, raising concerns about my impartiality is perfectly reasonable. In fact, I did expect it to happen. The only thing that surprised me was how few of you expressed that opinion. Nevertheless, it's definitely worth talking about. So, how do you, my lovely, lovely audience, how do you know 100% guaranteed, beyond any question of doubt, that my review of Tiger Knight on this week's Casual Saturday video was completely impartial? You don't. You don't. You just have to trust me. That's the thing. Because it's all based on trust. Now, I like to think that given I've been doing this for several years now, and this is the first time I have ever done a sponsored review of a new game, that I've built up a certain measure of trust with you guys. At least, you know, those of you who are regular viewers and possibly even subscribers. So, just to put your minds at rest, I'm going to go through the process of what it actually involves in getting me to do a sponsored video. Because many have tried, and many have failed. In fact, only one person has actually successfully managed to get me to do it so far, and that is Oasis Games, with Tiger Knight Empire War. So, why were they successful, where everybody else has failed? There's two answers to that question. There's a short answer, and there's a long answer. And the short answer is, make your game good. It's as simple as that. And, you know, approach me and say, here's some money, do a review of this game. If your game is good, I'm entirely happy to do a sponsored video on it. Well, it also has to be something that I think enough of you are going to find interesting and might also want to play. But it really is as simple as that. Just produce a good game. That's all you have to do. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, Jingles, if it's as simple as that, if that's all somebody has to do, produce a good game and then send it to you wrapped in £5 notes, how come you've only ever done one sponsored video review? Well, apparently it's really, really hard to produce a good game. Or at least to produce a good game that I think you lot might actually want to play as well. You wouldn't believe the number. I mean, I get a lot of offers. I get a ridiculous amount of offers in any given week, and some of them are completely ridiculous. I mean, just this week alone, I had somebody who makes garden chairs. Right, yeah, I know. And not a game about garden chairs, just actual garden chairs, asking if I wanted to do a video about their garden chairs. I mean, no, I really don't. I am not that desperate for a garden chair. I mean, what would a video about garden chairs be like in the first place? You know, I just don't. I wouldn't even know where to start. But you can get a general idea of the sheer volume of utter drivel that I get in the mail every week from various people trying to basically buy my audience, you guys, for some relatively cheap marketing. So the overwhelming majority of offers that I get, I just look at the title of the email, and usually right there and then I can tell, nope. delete. So there's that. But then I get offers from companies that are selling things that are actually relevant, like, for example, professional studio quality recording microphones. Because I use a professional studio quality recording microphone every day when I'm doing these videos. But how do you do a video? Yeah, you know what I mean? I mean, yeah, okay. I'm not entirely sure how many of you lot would be interested in it, but you can see why a manufacturer might want to approach a YouTuber who does commentary on videos to promote their new microphone. It does kind of make sense. But then I have to turn them down as well, because how the hell do you do a video on a microphone? I mean, I just plug it in, switch it on, and talk into it, and that is the limit of my technical experience and expertise as far as this sort of thing is concerned. I mean, if you want to get hardware reviews on microphones, then go to tomshardware.com. But thank you for your interest, but no, I'm going to have to pass on that one as well. So you can kind of see how there's a natural sort of weeding process involved in the kind of emails I even look at when it comes to paid sponsorship of various different products, services and games. But then we come to the actual games, and games are obviously my bread and butter. It's what I do, it's what I'm known for. And I do get a lot of offers from games developers and games publishers to take a look at their new product and do a video on it. And yet so far I've only ever done it once. Why is that, Jingles? Well, and again, it all comes down to trust. If there's no money changing hands, and Wargaming come out with a brand new tank destroyer, for example, for World of Tanks, and I get a hold of this thing and I run it through its paces and I think, I like this machine. I can do a video on that machine and say, yeah, I like this machine. And I'll tell you why I like the machine. I say, it's, you know, it's good at this, it's good at that, it's good at that. It's not so good at this, but it's made up for it by the fact that it can do that. And that's why I like this machine. There's no suspicion. Well, I'd like to think there's no suspicion, although there are plenty of people out there that have been saying for years that I'm in the pocket of wargaming, although how anybody can say that with a straight face when they've seen any of my World of Warplanes videos, I don't know. Nevertheless, you know, haters are going to hate. But when there's no money changing hands, and I have never been given a thing by Wargaming, by the way, ever. Well, that's not strictly true. All of the community contributors get a goodie bag at Christmas as a sort of Christmas present from Wargaming, and it's stuff like bonus codes and pens. And so, yeah, all right, Wargaming gave me a pen, so yeah, Jingles, you sold out. But yeah, no money has ever changed hands between myself and Wargaming. I love their games, and that's why I do videos on their games. And the same criteria applies to anybody that wants to pay me to do a review of one of their games. I have to love their game. Simple as that. Also, we have to be honest and upfront about it. Right at the start of the video, I have to be able to say, this is a sponsored video, just so you know that money has changed hands. And you can bear that in mind when you listen to what I have to say about the game. But the most important thing is I have to love that game. Now, I've been offered to do, well, I'll give you one example in particular, MechWarrior Online, which is not a bad game. I mean, I know it's got its critics, but I think MechWarrior Online is a reasonably good game. And it had been available via direct download from Piranha Games' website for ages. In fact, that's where I first downloaded and played MechWarrior Online. But last year they were gearing up to do a big publish of the game on Steam. And as part of that, they were trying to drum up as much media interest as possible. And I was one of the people that Piranha Games approached with an offer to do a sponsored video on MechWarrior Online. Now, I had played MechWarrior Online before, and it wasn't that I'd uninstalled it, but I'd upgraded PCs. I can't remember what had happened to the old one. I think it might have been the PC that blew up. And I'd never gotten around to reinstalling it, because while the game was okay, it didn't really hold my interest enough for me to go ahead and reinstall it on the new PC. Nevertheless, it had been a long time since I'd played MechWarrior Online, and a lot can happen. The game could have changed, and so I thought, you know, okay, sure, I mean, I'll take a look at it, definitely. And that's exactly what I did. Downloaded it again, reinstalled it again, spent a good few hours playing through it again, and I had exactly the same problems with the latest version of MechWarrior Online as I did all the way back when I first started playing it. The game had definitely improved in certain respects. I mean, the new tutorials that they'd put in were very, very good, and the game badly needed them, because here's the thing. The Mech Lab in MechWarrior Online, for those of you who have absolutely no idea what that is, just think of the garage in World of Tanks. You know, the bits that you mess around with and tinker with when you're not actually out there in the battlefield. It was incomprehensible. You had no idea what was going on. It was like that when I first played MechWarrior Online, and despite the improvements that they'd made to the interface and the tutorials in particular, which were good, it was just like that all over again the second time I downloaded it and played it. I had some issues with the gameplay as well, but on the whole the gameplay was not bad. But not bad isn't good enough, and there were certain, those Mech Lab issues and the okay gameplay held me back from being able to say, this is a really, really good game. Go out and play it. And because I couldn't say that, I really just didn't feel right taking several $1,000s off Piranha Games if I couldn't unequivocally, wholeheartedly recommend their game. And that's pretty much exactly what I said to Piranha Games. I said, look, best of luck with the launch on Steam, but I'm not going to be taking money off you to do a video on this game. And that's my criteria. If I cannot honestly put my hand on my heart and say, I really, really enjoyed this game, I had a lot of fun playing it, maybe it has some issues, but the issues are minor, and I think, on the whole, anybody that plays this game is going to enjoy it. If I can't say that, I'm not going to do a sponsored video on your game. Simple as that. Because at the end of the day, you can't put a price on a reputation, and it is all about trust. Trust between me and you. You have to trust me when I say I enjoyed this game. Now, you can make your own mind up about whether or not you think you're going to enjoy the game as well, based on what I've shown you of the gameplay. But that's always been the case, or at least I hope it has. I mean, I don't think you're all mindless drones who are just going to go out and buy a game or download a free-to-play game and then maybe support it through microtransactions purely because the mighty Jingles has told you to. Hopefully, you know, you're all smart enough to be able to make your own decisions where that sort of thing is concerned based on the gameplay that I showed you. But before we even get that far, you have to believe, you have to trust me, that I enjoyed the game enough for me to want to actually make a video about it in the first place. Because without that trust, everything that I say from that point on is completely suspect. And that is why I insist. It's not even negotiable. I insist on being able to say, both at the start of the video and in the first line of the video description, this is a sponsored video. I have been paid to look at this game. I'm not even going to think of hiding it, so that you guys know right from the start exactly where we both stand as far as the video that you're about to watch is concerned. Money has changed hands, but I'm asking you to trust me that I enjoyed the game enough to agree to do the video on it in the first place, regardless of any financial transactions that may have taken place. Because at the end of the day, you cannot put a price on your reputation. And so, with that subject put to bed, it's not quite the end of this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, because now I'm going to promote a game completely 100% for free just because I can and I think it deserves it. Has anybody ever played this War of Mine? It was a great little independent game that I found on Steam over a year ago now. And it was unusual in that while it was set inside a war zone, you didn't actually play the role of any of the soldiers. Instead, you took control of a bunch of the civilians in the war zone, just trying to survive from day to day. It was a really, really good game. Well, one of the developers of this War of Mine, his name, I'll have a stab at pronouncing it, but again, I apologise if I get your name wrong. His name is Rafał Wlosek. He worked not only on this War of Mine, but also on another game which I've never played called Anomaly 2, and designed most of the mechanics in both games. Well, he's now branched out on his own. He's no longer working for commercial companies because he wanted to start his own project. It's called War Builder, and it's kind of similar to Robocraft. I'll put a link down below in the video description to the YouTube video which shows what the game involves. And the reason that he contacted me was because since he and his development team, 3 whole people, it's a real independent project here, they're basically paying for it themselves. They've managed to get almost all of the core game mechanics in place in the space of just 6 months, but they don't have any money for marketing. Now, they're pushing the alpha test of the game live at the end of March, and the problem is they don't have any money for marketing. So they need people to play it so that they can actually alpha test the game. But nobody's heard of it, and that's where I come in. And hopefully that's also where you come in. So I'm entirely happy to support Rafał. Yes, I just remembered his name. I'm entirely happy to support Rafał and try to drum up some players so that this game can get tested, because I loved, well, one of his previous projects, this War of Mine. I haven't played Anomaly 2, and I think he definitely deserves it. So link down below in the video description. Doing my thing to help out independent games developers, and hopefully maybe find a new game that you guys are going to like as well. That's War Builder, brand new independent title, going into alpha test at the end of March. Link down below in the video description. Rafał, entirely happy to help, and hopefully you get what you need. And that is it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. Hope you enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.